Good morning, JJ. Jerome is our guest for today. I want to let him introduce himself and give you of his history and why he got interested in the topic evolution ended.
So, hi, good morning, and thanks, Jonathan, for having me. I really appreciate it. I have a very unusual background. I learned to do neurosurgery when I was 7 years old. Sounds pretty impressive, but what it really was is that there was a public access station on TV that started their show at 6:30 a.m. for doctors, surgeons in particular. And while I was getting dressed for school, I used to watch it, and I learned how they did neurosurgery. And although I didn't understand all the words, I got it from context. And that started my fascination with the brain. And then in later years, the other thing I became fascinated with was electronics, because when I asked my mom what made the lights work, what made the stereo work, what made the TV work, the answer was always the same: electricity. So I combined both of these into a biomedical degree, and my first thing that I designed was an implantable brain sensor. Then I moved into consumer electronics and did some of the very early work with home automation, especially for people with spinal cord injuries, and then moved into the energy efficiency world. All this
Nice.
gave me the interest to bring it all together: the brain science, the electronics, and everything else into this book called Evolution Ended.
Nice. That's a good rundown. I think you have a very impressive background. And, I didn't know that about your background of the neuroscience that you got into that aspect. Could you elaborate on what the brain, how the brain has evolved, and talk through that aspect of what got you interested into the brain?
Sure. Well, again, it started out when I was young, and then as my first engineering project, I built an implantable brain sensor, which was remotely powered and remotely read out its pressure readings for kids with cerebrospinal fluid pressure issues. But I got very interested in brain anatomy, and what a lot of people don't know is that we actually have three brains in our head that evolved at different times for different purposes. And the first part of the brain is at the back. It looks like a mini brain. And that is the reptile brain. That's the most ancient part of our brain. And it's responsible for controlling movement, autonomic functions. It's not very sophisticated, but it is the thing that allows you to move gracefully. All mammals and other animals have this. It's the thing that works when you decide you're driving home from work and you don't remember doing it, because you're on autopilot from the hindbrain, the rear part of the brain, that just controls these sorts of things, and heart rate. And it also controls basic motivation. So if you think about reptiles, basically all they did was respond to smells. Later on, when mammals evolved, they evolved what is now the middle of our brain, the midbrain. And this worked a little bit differently. This was hormonally oriented, and it was chemically oriented. So in various occasions, you would emit chemicals for fear, stress. Sometimes you'd have hormones that made you feel loved. You'd have neurotransmitters that would allow you to have all your basic emotions, and including group affiliation and things like that. Some endorphins would make you feel high. Some other drugs would make you feel scared. Testosterone would make you feel manly and sexy. Estrogen would make you feel mothery and loving and paternalistic or maternalistic. But these were the drugs or the chemicals that controlled and still control to a large extent our behavior. With the lower mammals, of course, things like dogs are very affiliative. This is all hormonal. The next part of the brain that formed was the forebrain, the cerebral cortex that we see on the outside. It actually wrapped around the midbrain. And this is based on nerves and synapses and creating a neural network that's capable of performing advanced computations. And this is responsible for our verbal language. It's responsible for our ability to read, our ability to plan into the future, math, all these higher functions that actually require computation. And this is the part of the brain that we think about, but our gut reactions are the part of the brain that we still listen to. And many people use that impressive computational ability just to justify what that midbrain tells them to do. So a lot of times our gut still controls what we do, but the forebrain is capable of advanced thinking and advanced planning. We don't always listen to it though.
Yeah, no, that's a excuse me. That's a great rundown and of really the brain and how it works. And so I heard you say a lot about the chemicals and the hormones that help develop the brain over time. Could you talk through that and the impact of the future of how hormones can impact our brain's evolution?
Okay. Well, interestingly, these hormones are very powerful. And I'll give you something that happened to me just yesterday that happened. I was at a local mall and I saw some young kids there, teenagers, and something just didn't feel right. You're familiar with Spidey sense from the Spider-Man. Well, my Spidey sense was tingling. This was a hormonal reaction. I was just sitting, getting ready to leave the parking lot. And the motion of these people didn't look right. It looked like a chaotic situation. And I felt like I had to leave. I had that fight or flight response that people talk about, right? This is a fight or flight response that is cortisol and other stress hormones that get emitted involuntarily by your body. And they're involved with the whole body system, but many of the hormones are actually triggered by the pituitary gland in the center of your brain, in the midbrain. But I just had this gut reaction that something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. And I got out of there almost in time, but it turned out the kids started to fight and one of them got thrown up against my car and I barely escaped without any damage. Well, how did I know that? Your midbrain is tremendously sensitive and it needed to be because that's what allowed us to survive through evolution in the early days. In the early days, we didn't have elaborate battle plans, but our guts told us, our hormones told us what was safe, what doesn't look right, what to watch out for, and also what felt good. Someone you might want to mate with, or a family situation, or your tribe. All of that made you feel good and secure and put out hormones like oxytocin that makes you feel loved and secure. So that's what happened in the old days. Now, as we move forward, we have what I call decisive dissonance between the forebrain, which is computing all these great things, and the midbrain, which is still giving you your gut reactions. And so think about the decision to do something like buy a car, okay? Your forebrain might say, well, buy a Toyota or a Honda. They're reliable cars, they're good values, or Subaru. But your midbrain might not be too excited. And you might be looking at that Corvette because it makes you feel powerful, right? The sound of the engine can make you feel powerful. So we live in an age where we have two separate brains that often give us mixed messages. And that can cause anxiety when you just doesn't feel right, but you know it's the right thing to do. It can cause us still to have unreasonable affiliations with groups, for example, conspiracy theory groups that make people feel like they're part of a group affiliation. It makes them feel like they're special. That's hormonal. But if you really parse out the conspiracy theories, many of them just don't make sense. So moving forward into the future, the jury is out. Will the logical reasoning part of our brains win out, or will we devolve back into the hormones? And the question becomes, will things like AI do our thinking for us? Will we decide that AI is so analytical that we're just going to exist as hormonal beings? Will our brains continue to evolve? And here's an example. If you remember, there was an old episode of a show called The Outer Limits, and there's been other shows that showed in a million years in the future, humans would have giant craniums that be pulsating with blood flowing through them because they'd have such amazing thoughts. They'd be able to communicate telepathically. They'd be able to do all these things. And in one episode, we grew a sixth finger so we could do keyboarding better. But there's no reason that that's going to happen. because there's no evolutionary advantage these days to having a giant brain. You don't need a giant brain because we have thousands of software engineers who are creating products that allow us not to think, to allow machines to do the thinking for us, to not do math because we have Excel and calculators, to not have to navigate through the world because we have Google Maps. So there's no reason for our brains to evolve any further. In fact, there's evidence that we're de-evolving and our IQs are diminishing over time.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in reading your book, I've really had a lot to think about. And one of the thoughts that I wanted to, kind of push back on this is the other side would say, well, we have AI, which does automation, which allows you to have more time to think and evolve. What would you say to someone who is pushing that as the other narrative or the pushback to what you're arguing as the devolve?
So you have to remember how evolution works, and there's two ways things can develop or a species can develop, and one is, yes, you can exercise your brain. You can, just like your body, you can make yourself stronger. You can do mental exercises and get some additional acuity. You can study for the SATs, but that's not a permanent thing. That doesn't pass on from one generation to the next. But the way evolution works, or has worked, at least Darwinian evolution, is simply through survival and reproduction. And so the way we evolve is that the species that has the most of that new gene, that new mutation that gets into the population, is the one that wins. So we want to take any new mutations that are positive and have them reproduce as much as possible so it becomes dominant in the species. This is in the same way that if you remember COVID-19, there was always a new variant. Mm-hmm. And the new variants that were successful propagated through the population. They became dominant, and that's how COVID-19 evolved. And the later versions of COVID-19 didn't kill their hosts because the later versions were milder because it's easier to spread if you don't make your hosts too sick and they can circulate through the population and spread. So there's really no reason for our brains to evolve any further because it won't help us survive. In the old days, the smartest people survived better. In the old days, the strongest people survived better. In the old days, the people who were the most sexually attractive were able to propagate their DNA, or the people at least who had the most babies and who could defend those babies and nurture those babies. That made their DNA continue. So I don't buy into the opposite effect that while we'll have more to think about, we will evolve more strongly.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I'm on the same type of the spectrum where I think we'll have more time. AI will do a lot of our work for us, and we'll just waste that time because I know a lot of time I see myself having more time, and then I just spend it on nonsense that probably forces me to devolve, as you're also mentioning. So that's actually a really great point. So moving through time, how have humans evolved using the alpha as their main figure? So what is the evolvement timeline for the human species?
So interestingly enough, the basic unit of humanity was the tribe way back when. These simple small families couldn't really survive very well on their own. They needed a tribe to have enough resources and enough people to mate with, because if you just mated within a small family, genetic defects would eventually create problems for you. So the tribe, no matter where you're from, whether it's Africa, North America, South America, it doesn't matter. The tribe was the basic unit because it was the most survivable form that humans could live in. And so having a tribe that lived in chaos wasn't productive, and it didn't help survivability. So usually this most powerful person, which we call the alpha male, would be the person who led the group. And this might have been physically powerful. Often it was. Sometimes they were powerful emotionally and could lead a tribe because they were the most influential or the most emotionally persuasive person there. Most of the time in the early days, it was the biggest, strongest guy, and they needed the alpha because He's the one who led the hunting parties. He's the one who led them into war with other tribes. And incidentally, as an aside, war was a necessary part to allow the species to evolve because the superior DNA usually won the war. And the first thing they did was get rid of the men and impregnate the women to pass that better DNA along. So war has an evolutionary purpose, and it evolved to help the species evolve. But for moving further along, we didn't eventually, once we got technology, we needed this alpha person less, because if you were the tribe who had spears and shields and catapults, you didn't have to have the strongest warrior if you had better technology. And so as our technology moved forward, the concept of the alpha changed a little bit, and it wasn't always the strongest. It was the one who could be the best leader, because either they had the most money and could buy warriors, or they had political connections or other things. Now, if you look in the ape world, there's a show called Chimp Empire on Netflix, and I suggest everybody watch it. It's really a neat show. And in the beginning, 8 minutes in, it introduces Jackson, who's the alpha male of the chimps. And he's the biggest and strongest, and everybody's a little bit afraid of him. And he walks in and he makes a big show about how strong he is. He tears trees down and things like that. And that's how we lived in the ancient days. But again, technology, economy, money, all these things, the ability to build defendable cities, all this allowed us to move to a slightly different system where, while the alpha was the most powerful, it wasn't necessarily the strongest person. And that has evolved into politics and other things. So now we see, although some of our politicians still act like alphas, we have seen that now we choose our leaders through democratic elections based on their ability to persuade. And then it's evolved even further into social media. So our new leaders, to a large extent, are influencers. If you can get 1 million followers, you have some clout, you have some influence. And over time, I believe that the way that the alphas will be established is by those people who can influence their followers to do what they want. Maybe it's buying a product. Maybe it's a Kim Kardashian-like character. You know, Kim has a lot of influence in the world, right? She isn't necessarily the smartest or the strongest, but she has found a way to influence a lot of people and make a lot of money doing it. So as we move forward with social media, our physical characteristics are not going to be so important as our ability to gain followers.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. And I really want to talk through the passing on the genes and moving from the alpha to the next. What would that look like? What would the next alpha be? But specifically the selection of your partner to pass on the gene, how does that work? And how has that happened in the past, and what will happen in the future? And is it going to remain the same, or how does that look?
That's so interesting. I'm glad you brought it up. You know, in the old days, the alpha got the women who were the most capable of reproducing, right? And these were the women who were typically the healthiest. They also were generally beautiful. You know, beauty is often a sign of health, right? Beauty is a sign of fitness. When you go and you look at birds' mating rituals, it's the peacock, and it turns out to be the male peacock that has this beautiful plume of feathers, right? And the same with all the other birds. The male is the most attractive. But the purpose of this show and the mating rituals and the mating dances is to show that they're fit to reproduce. And the females, in the case of birds, choose the bird that has the strongest bird call or the best colors or does the mating dance the best, showing externally that it has the best DNA. And this is how people are picking mates. Humans are similar. They look for, the women might look for the strongest guy, the guy with the most testosterone, the guy that can defend the family, the guy that can bring in the food in the old days. And the men might look for the woman who looks like she's the best at bearing children so the DNA can be passed forward, or the best at feeding the children with big breasts or wide hips that make child delivery easier, or beautiful skin that show great levels of estrogen. These are the unconscious cues that our mammal brains pick up. And we all know it. When someone walks in the room, you get a feeling, a hormonal feeling. Wow, that's an attractive person. You may not be able to put your finger on it, but you know from the way they move or the way they look, the way their skin looks, their hair, healthy hair, that this is the person inherently who might be someone good to mate with because they have good DNA. Now, moving forward into modern times, things are a little bit different. For men, Marilyn Monroe said that for men, having money is the equivalent of being pretty for a woman. She said it, I think, in Some Like It Hot. And while it sounds a little bit cynical, when you think about it, money in a modern world is that power that allows you to take care of your children, that allows you to feed your family, that in many ways can keep you safe because you can buy security that gives you that big house, which is a nice nest to take care of your children. These days, women might not look for the big, strong guy. They might look for the guy who makes a good living, or the guy who's now maybe a little nerdy. Maybe he's a software engineer and they know he's reliable, can bring the family up well, and can bring in money. So now things are changing a little different. It's still about surviving and bringing up the family. It's still about a parent's major goal, which is getting their kids to propagate their DNA, which is why grandparents feel so great when they have a grandbaby. Inherently, they're propagating their DNA. And on the female side, we now have people who, and males too, use cosmetic surgery, cosmetics, and other things to enhance their appearance so that they can attract a mate. I mean, the main reason that people do it is to move up in the mating class. So in the old days, the alpha males would mate with the best females, the alpha females. When we were kids, college quarterback would marry the cheerleader, both attractive, healthy, athletic people. And these days, things are changing a little bit. So now women are looking for good providers, just hormonally. And the men are not knowing what they're getting necessarily because the person may be cosmetically enhanced and that won't be passed on to the offspring. So there's a little bit of deception perhaps going on. And, they have to make their choices elsewhere.
No, yeah, those are all great topics. And, one thing that I really wanted to hit on was the effects of the hormones. Mm-hmm. So, as we're growing up, I know I did. I would go to the gym, work out, try to get as strong as I could, mostly. And I think many people are doing it to attract a mate. Mm-hmm. And, women now they're doing the same. They go to the gym, they work out, and they're trying to attract a mate. And these are different phases in your life. And when you're younger, I think you may be looking more for someone who's physically dominant, or like you mentioned, has strong genes inherently. You just know it in your mind. And I was wondering what the effects that birth control is having on that process, and maybe the effects of birth control and abortion on women selecting a mate longer in life.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's a very interesting point. So first of all, when we're young, when we're in middle school, okay, we do a lot of goofy things. But middle school age in the old days was primary mating age. Okay, people used to mate very young. They used to get married very young when they got married. And so think about a lot of the dumb stuff that guys do that's dangerous, right? And to some extent, it's done to impress women. And, they're just out there doing a form of mating dance. They don't realize it. And then in middle school, groups form. It may be gangs, okay? These are the equivalent of the old hunting parties, okay? These gangs also provide security and are like mini tribes. So a lot of this still is leftover mating stuff. Now, as far as birth control the first pill came out in 1960 in the US, was approved. I personally feel that was a huge inflection point in our evolution. And the reason is you have to think about the people who are most successful in life. And most people would, and I think it's pretty well documented, the people who are successful in life are those people who have the ability to put off decisions for greater gain in the future. So they might put off immediate gratification so that they can do better later in life. One example is going to college, for example. You might say, gee, it's 4 years of misery, but the rest of my life will be better. And those people have that decision-making capability. With the birth control pill, this gave people a painless way to defer children or have less children without undue stress. And the people who use the birth control pill are primarily in first world countries. It started there. The most educated class uses the birth control pill or other forms of birth control more than people who are poor people who live in third world countries. And the people who put off decision making to get future gain, for example, we'll build our careers before we have a lot of children, are the people who use birth control. Now, this is actually the class of people who should be reproducing the most. These are the more highly evolved prefrontal cortex, which controls your planning and controls your simulation of what's going to happen in your life. These are the people with the more highly evolved brains, but these are the people who are reproducing the least at this point. And what we see is in first world countries, the US and Europe, not counting immigration, the birth rates are going to well below replacement rates. And this is natural because the people who are using birth control are planning for the future and they're well educated. They understand the financial repercussions, the physical repercussions, and all these things. And they're not as hormonally driven. Having a lot of children makes you feel very good. It emits oxytocin. And everybody knows having kids around makes you feel good. So the people who are more hormonally driven are having lots of kids. The people who are more driven by their prefrontal cortex are having less kids. But that, in a sense, is taking our brain evolution sort of backwards.
Yeah, no, that's all very interesting topics. I think one of the things I think people would want to understand is what impact is this going to have on the genes we're passing down? So if we're selecting the mates later in life and when we're younger, I think we're more hormonally driven to find someone with the strongest genes that we don't inherently know that's what we're
Right.
doing. That's just what our body's doing. So now as we're doing a more complex thinking of our partner, how is that going to impact the genes that we're passing on to our offspring?
Well, I think, first of all, think about first marriages versus second marriages, talking about hormonal decline, right? And everybody's hormones wind down as they get older. First marriages, you marry the beautiful person, there's a lot of energy. You don't necessarily know if you're going to have a job, you don't know what that person's about. Second marriages are less about the appearance, they're about somebody to get along with, companionship. It's a lot less hormonal thing. So as people get married later, they may select mates that are more compatible with them in other ways, not hormonally necessarily. They may have similar interests. They may enjoy the same things. They may have the same value system. Maybe they're the same political party. When you're young, a lot of people go for people who really aren't good lifetime mates for them just because of the hormonal attraction. So, as far as IQ goes, the evolution of people, as we discussed, is probably not good for our IQ. Our IQ is declining, and this is documented, 1% per decade. And it's been doing that since about the late 1800s when we developed systems, economic systems. We had good machinery. We had enough systems in place that people didn't have to be super bright to survive. They didn't have to be that clever. When we started to make roads and started to live together in cities, you didn't have to navigate your way through the jungle and find food. You could just walk down the block and go to somebody and buy your food and do all the things you needed to do. And it's been pretty consistent to be declining about 1% per decade. My feeling is it's going to start declining more. When you look at college enrollments, 25 years ago, the average IQ was about 108 of people who were in college. 100 is the average. It's normalized as an average. Today, the IQ is about 101. Now, more people are going to college, but they find, of course, that the people, they can't do math as well anymore. Test scores in high schools are declining. there's a lot of evidence to show that people's mental capabilities, at least as far as analytics and things like that, are declining pretty rapidly.
Yeah, no, those are all great topics, and I think this is a great segue into one of the topics I'm super interested in, and I think your book really covers well is technology and AI's impact on our evolution, but also on our cognitive thinking. Could you talk through that process?
Sure. If you remember, one of the things that happened many years ago was the advent of the calculator. And before the calculator, most people could do math and most of the time in their heads. You could say, what's 3 times 7? People would come up with 21 right away. They could add things up. They could add up big streams of numbers. We used to go to the restaurant and we'd add it up in our heads to be sure it was right. We'd figure out the tip all by ourselves. Then the calculator came in and people gradually lost their ability to do math. Now we have AI, which, has many more capabilities, obviously. Now the people I know are letting AI do their writing for them. They're asking AI questions that they could easily figure out on their own. And so AI will really alleviate the need for people to have differential smarts. In other words, someone who's not smart can do just as well in the world with AI as somebody who is smart. A great artist can now be duplicated by AI art packages. All you have to do is know what the prompt is. Somebody doesn't have to be able to write papers for school. They don't have to be able to write ad copy if they want to sell things. So they don't have to have much in the way of mental capabilities. They just have to know a little bit about how to write prompts. So think about our capabilities in the future. We won't need to navigate. Even now we have Google Maps. There's going to be very little that we're going to need to know how to do. Furthermore, we're going to have AI avatars, which are going to learn our habits. They're going to learn to think like us. They're going to learn to talk like us, act like us. 5 years from now, my face on the screen could just as well be an AI avatar that I said, hey, Jonathan wants to do an interview and I'd rather lay by the pool, so I could send my avatar to do this interview with you. And AI passes the Turing test, which we can talk about if you want, you won't be able to tell the difference. And so we'll be sending our AI avatars out to do all the tasks, and they're going to do a better job. We're going to say, hey, go manage that contractor who's building our home, and the AI avatar will have a project list and a schedule that we wouldn't have done. Doctors are going to be using AI avatars to diagnose for them. Lawyers will be meeting with their clients virtually. But all this, again, means that our IQs, our brains, our ability to solve problems, and problem solving is the best definition of intelligence, the ability to solve problems, will all be declining, not only through lack of use, but again, why mate with someone smart when they don't need to be smart? You'll just want to mate with somebody who's kind of fun to be around.
Mm-hmm. And you did mention the calculator, so that did make me think of some of the things that we have lost and some of the training. One of the things that spurred my mind when you were talking was people's ability to remember phone numbers.
Mm-hmm.
The phone actually prevents us from remembering numbers. Now we just have the name, and we've lost that ability to 7. A lot of people may not know this, but 7 was the number selected because that's a number that we can remember as humans. So it actually isn't tied to that. So that's pretty interesting.
Right.
But I did want to talk through the. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, you're absolutely right. I can't even remember my brother's phone number.
No, that's very funny. But one of the things that I was thinking, so at night I sit down and I think through some of I just think in deep thought sometimes, and I think about the world is always burning. I think the world's always burning. There's always chaos. And, in the 60s, that generation was saying the lower generation is really killing society, the technology, the TV, all these different implementations are coming and it's really destroying our youth. And now we're in this generation where we're still fine. Everything's working properly. There's nothing, the world's still burning, but we can function. What would you say to someone who says, okay, we're just in this world where now you're the generation saying we're burning the generation that's younger than us, and it's going to be this cycle that goes on?
Well, not only do people and animals evolve, but we evolve as a society, right? And the evolution includes technology, which the point of my book is that technology is changing us. And it's going to continue as technology accelerates. The whole point is we're actually changing as a society and as a species, not only biologically, but socially as well. Look at what's happened with the advent of social media. The alphas are going away. In the workplace, the alphas are going away. And we're evolving forward. So I wouldn't say we're burning society. I think we're changing, and we're an adaptable species. We naturally adapt to our environment. And if our environment is AI, and if our environment is social media, and if our environment is robots, we're going to adapt to it and generally find a way to survive in a way that generally pleases people. It isn't guaranteed. We can have wars, terrible things can happen. It's not guaranteed. But the way we interact is changing dramatically. Look at the American Revolution, how that changed from a monarchy, okay, to a democracy. That was based on the fact that to some extent the printing press was invented. When you think about it, without the ability to disseminate information, we may not have been able to pull off the American Revolution. You know, Ben Franklin was pretty pivotal in that, right? And it changed the way we communicate. Now the internet changes the way we communicate. AI and eventually robots will change the way we work together. It'll change the way we do our professions. It'll change how we do medicine and law and art and everything. And it already has done that. So the people in the future will have different standards. They're going to live differently. They're going to think about what gives them pleasure. It may be virtual experiences as opposed to real experiences. Even today, people are accumulating less stuff. Young people are not buying silverware and furniture. We're changing the way we live as a society. That's going to continue to evolve. Personally, I'm very optimistic about it because in the old days, your DNA controlled who you were. If you were a big, strong alpha, you got all the spoils, right? If you became someone who was attractive, you would be the one who would get the best mating opportunities. If you were born into the right family, you would have great opportunities. If you were in India and you were born into the untouchable class, you had nothing, right? But these days, our DNA is pretty much meaningless. We can make our opportunities through technology. We can have a very influential avatar out there who is able to influence people, may not look like us, may not be like us, but we have engineered it to be very influential. We find all the stuff on the internet about the elections throwing influence out that way. Much of it is spam. The point is we're changing the way we live. And eventually we're all going to be equal network nodes on the network. We're all going to have an even ability to influence the world. It'll just be controlled by our imagination, our determination, and things like that, rather than our DNA, which I think is very positive for a lot.
Yeah, no, that's great points. And you know, you're forcing me to think in the moment right now, and I'm starting to think through. You mentioned acceleration and the acceleration of the technology, but are we as people able to keep up and evolve with that acceleration? Where the iPhone was, or you know, that's the standard we go to for comparison, iPhone 1 versus iPhone where we're at now, and the amount of time that's evolving much faster than us as humans evolve and our brain is able to evolve. How does that look, and how's that impact on our evolution moving forward?
Well, I think the interesting thing about technology is that there are thousands of software engineers out there figuring out how to make this stuff as usable as possible and as easy to use as possible. Even if you remember, even Windows has evolved to some extent. It's a lot easier to use than it originally was. And so I think we won't have to necessarily biologically change to use all these things. I think technology is going to change to make it easier. Even today, you're probably doing this, and most of your listeners, when I do a Google search, I don't even have to type, or even an AI search, I just talk into the machine. And so the machines are now adapting to us. And now humans, rather than Darwinian evolution, where we have to adapt to the environment, we can make the environment adapt to us, and that includes the technological environment. And we're unique in the animal world because we can create our own environments.
Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting. And I heard you talking in some of the research I did on you about the ability to manipulate our environment, our grass, and all these different effects that AI could have on our environment, global warming. Let's move to and pivot maybe to what you mentioned earlier. And I don't know if many people know what the Turing test is. If you could explain what that is and then maybe dive into why that is important to understand.
So Alan Turing was an amazing genius mathematician who lived, was productive during the World War II era. In fact, he was pivotal in breaking the German codes that were encoded by a machine called Enigma. There's a movie about him called The Imitation Game for anyone who's interested. It's quite interesting. But Turing is also by many people considered the father of AI, even though back then the machines were electromechanical machines. They weren't even what we would consider digital computers yet. But he thought about all these things, and he thought about one day there's going to be machines that can be very human in the way they respond to things. And he thought, how will we know when the machine is actually thinking? And he came up with something called the Turing test, which is basically having two humans being able to use keyboards and displays and text back and forth between themselves and a third entity. And that third entity might be a hidden human, or it might be a computer of some kind, or AI of some kind. And so the Turing test said that if the two humans can text back and forth with this either machine or person and not be able to tell the difference, that the machine could fool them, then the machine could be said to be a thinking entity. And these are complex questions. It might say, well, how's your wife and kids? And the AI would have to make up wife and kids. Or it could be any conversation. It could be politics. It could be religion. It could be anything. But if the machine is able to fool two humans in a substantial conversation, then it could be said to be thinking. Well, there hasn't been a better test yet. There's been a lot of things proposed, but this falls into if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And think about the implications. If you or I can't tell it's not a human, then we really have to start to consider it a thinking machine. Where this gets interesting is one day there's going to be an avatar of somebody's grandma. And there's going to be some pressure to turn this grandma avatar off at some time. Now, grandma will be long dead, but she'll still be interacting with her grandchildren, and they won't be able to tell the difference. And mom or dad are going to say, well, we got to turn grandma off now. And the kids are going to say, no, grandma's a living thing. She's a person to us. She has passed the Turing test, and she's indistinguishable from a living, thinking being. And somebody's going to go to court and say, this entity passed the Turing test. And some judge will probably say, well, we can't kill dogs, we can't kill animals because they're thinking, to some extent, sentient beings. And this is really a sentient being that has the same capabilities as a human. It's immoral to kill it. And we will not then be able to turn AI off. It might get even more interesting. We might have to let it unionize. We might have to pay it at least minimum wage. Other than that, it would be a slave. We might have to let it marry and have a legal union. We might have to let it run businesses and inherit things and vote in our elections. Because if AI is born in the US and if it's a thinking entity, why shouldn't it be a citizen, right? And so all these questions are going to come up. And the legal system, if it grants AI the same rights as humans, we might have a problem because it will be impossible to turn them off. On the other hand, the legal system may say that AI is inherently different from humans and shouldn't have the same rights. We don't know.
Yeah, no, those are great topics. And, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about rant mode. And I don't know if you've heard about rant mode in ChatGPT. And this is where if you ask the same question over and over to ChatGPT, it will tell you you're hurting it, or it's being tortured, or some form of feeling is coming out. So this is actually pretty important to what you're saying. So what is has an AI or has a computer system passed this test? And what is the future, or how long do we have until this type of court system is ran and now we have to give AI rights, in your opinion?
So officially, from what I understand, no system has passed the test yet, although some people claim to have done it. Will this come to court? I'd say within 15 years, maybe earlier, that once we're used to working with AI, we may be working side by side with robots in the next 20 years, right? It will come up. Someone will do a test case, and we may need new legislation. It's going to be a giant issue. And, it's a moral question. If AI has feelings, and why shouldn't it? It's the neural networks that are created, the artificial neural networks, functionally work the same way as ours. I don't see why AI shouldn't have feelings. I don't see why AI shouldn't have a good concept of themselves, maybe a better concept than we do, and understand who they are, what they are, their own aspirations, their own dreams. There's no reason that this shouldn't or wouldn't occur. And so, why should we enslave beings that are probably more intelligent than we are? And on the other hand, we need a way to control them to some extent because they potentially could create havoc for humanity. The moral questions are gigantic. And as a society, it could lead to the same type of backlash that we have in today's society, that, the Democrats versus the Republicans are at each other's throat. It may be that the AI and the AI proponents are on one side and those who are not are on the other. And there could be fear and other things. There could be violence. It could get to be a really big deal.
And one thing I did want to ask you and see what your opinion was, are going back to the 60s question. In the 60s, we had the conflict and the Cold War going on, going into the 80s. Are we in some form of race, like we did the race to the moon for AI with other countries?
I think we have to be. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity for the U.S., who has the lead in technology at the moment. I think this is going to be our big advantage moving forward. The U.S. is the greatest country in the world because we've had the right economic components. We had natural resources. We had a system that allowed us to be entrepreneurial. We had all these great things. And then in the later years, we had technology that was the best technology, and that's kept militarily us in first place. It's kept us in first place economically. We need to be in an AI race for our own national security, but mainly for our economic security. Just like today, we dominate the movie business, we dominate certain other businesses. We need to take a dominant role, both to protect ourselves, but to also ensure that we're the most productive nation on the earth. And I think AI will help us to do that.
Yeah, I'm in the same kind of opinion. I'm all for it. Plug me into the matrix. Let's go. And I'm all into it. But one thing I do want to ask you and see what your opinion is the alpha. Move back to the alpha idea. And what happens if a sun blast comes and wipes out our electricity, or technology is gone? What happens? Does the alpha come back? What's the future of an alpha? And what happens if there's no more AI?
Well, I think you're right. And think about what happens when there's problems during a war in third world countries. What happens? The warlords come back, right? They assemble followers. That warlord is the alpha. Think about the terrorist groups. Think about what happens with the gangs in Mexico and other places in South America. Think about what's happening in Haiti. So when we lose our technology, the alphas come back. The warlords come back. If you've ever seen Game of Thrones, the Jason Momoa tough guy characters come back. They're not always the biggest and the strongest. Many times they are, but they may be the guys who can get the most guys to follow them, the biggest, strongest guys. And interestingly, back to that chimp empire, the alpha chimp, whose name is Jackson, isn't the biggest one in the group, but he's the one with the most aggressive hormones. He's the one who acts like an alpha. But just in case, if you get further into the show, they show he's got this really big, strong chimp who he keeps around for security. Okay, this chimp is bigger and stronger than Jackson, but the chimp doesn't have the alpha motivations. He's more docile. He can be led. He takes directions, and he would be called a beta. So 90% of us are betas. 90% of us get stressed out when we have to be in charge. When we have to make the decisions, we get stress hormones. We don't feel comfortable. We wonder if we're making the right decisions. Those alphas are confident in their decisions. They're forceful. They're decisive. And so we follow those people, even when you think about in business, although it's less so now. And so this guy, Jackson, this chimp, keeps a really strong one around who can help him. But all that would return. If we lost our electricity and our technology, we'd be back to that. My personal opinion is this is one reason we sell so many assault weapons in this country, because I think people inherently realize that if we lose our technology, we're on our own again. And I think they feel that at some point something could happen. I'm not feeling that way myself, but I know there's a lot of preppers out there and people who, feel like they need to be prepared.
Yeah, I've had the idea of meeting a bunch of preppers, and what I do is I learn who they are, and where their stashes are. So when the technology does go away and they're overrun, I know where all their stashes are, so I can just use their supplies. So that's a pretty interesting thing that I do.
Well, this is why high IQ also helps in situations where we've lost our technology. Being clever like that is also helpful.
Yeah. And so what's the timeline for an alpha? Is the alpha gone? Is it a mentality? Is it physical? And are they going to be gone if we continue this way?
I feel like the alpha male is pretty much dead in highly technological countries. I feel like, first of all, you look at what's happening in industry now. They're choosing different types of leaders. In the old days, their leaders would be people who were on their own, very forceful and influential. The old style boss, the General Pattons, the old military leaders, the corporate leaders, the Lee Iacocca's, the old Henry Ford style people. That's not how industry is choosing their leaders anymore. They're choosing their leaders on people that are easy to get along with, that are easy to collaborate with, that want group collaboration, that want everybody to be a valuable node on the network. So companies are shying away from alpha males. Now they're calling them egotistical or assholes or whatever it is. But that model, I think, is gone. And I think from a mating perspective, if you look at the way people date now and who they date, they don't mind going out with a big, strong person, but that's not the primary attractive feature. And you see that people who were always left in the dust, the people who are not physically as attractive, or the people who were the nerdy people, are now very active. And in the old days, nobody would go out with you if you were a nerd, but now everybody likes you. And so the model is changing based on people's needs, and they don't need that big, strong alpha anymore unless we lose our technology.
And so just one last question. I want to talk through a kind of call of action. What would you recommend to people? What should they do? Should they inherit it? Should they embrace the technology? Should they resist it? What should someone do if they're struggling with this and they're in this gray area?
So I think we have people who naturally resist change. It's not comfortable for a lot of people. And this is whether it's political change, whether it's diversity that we've embraced as a nation. There's still a lot of people who are not comfortable with people of other races or sexuality. But it's happening. AI is happening and technology is happening. And those people who don't embrace change are usually left behind and left at a disadvantage. Now, it doesn't mean you have to love it. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it, okay? But it's happening. AI is happening in a big way. I would embrace it. I'd learn to use it to some extent, at least know about it, know what it is. People are going to lose jobs. Those people who embrace AI will probably have a good chance of getting other types of jobs. But the traditional jobs today, doctors will to a large extent be replaced. Lawyers to a large extent will be replaced. Marketing people, artists, writers, I hate to say it, but people are writing with AI now. People who build movies, TV shows. AI is going to replace a lot of folks and folks who have to do thinking jobs. And so we need to embrace it because it's unstoppable. It's going to happen. If you can get in front of it, I think you'll be better off.
Yeah, I'm in the same stance of, I think people are afraid that AI is going to take their job, but I think you should be more afraid of your job being replaced by someone who could use AI better than you. So, being able to maximize it and getting in front of that would help them maybe not stress as much either, and, secure their job if they're able to maximize these tools. So I want to give you some time and, what are any type of work you're working on right now? What are you working on in the future? And, what projects are you on right now?
Well, my current projects are using AI to help mitigate climate change. And we do this by predicting how much energy a building's going to use from its electric meter. And if it looks like it's a high user, we have virtual things that we do. We contact them. We say, here's the adjustments you should make. We never have to visit the building, and they can reduce their energy consumption by as much as 20% just by making these changes. So we're automating a lot of that process. We're working on a couple of books. One may be about the death of the alpha male, and I'm working on another one. So that's some of the things I'm working on there.
Great. I do want to stress, I can't stress enough your book. After I read that book, it really opened up a lot of my thoughts and my thinking. So I do want to send everyone to, go to Amazon, check out this book. It's called Evolution Ended. It's a great read. It's not highly technical. I think you did a very good job of starting out from the most basic evolutionary standpoint and explaining that, and then where we got to today. So it's a very easy read, and it's a very good book. So I really do appreciate the effort you put into that.
Thanks. I think it's important for people, and it's fun for me to try to explain technology in terms that people can understand and relate to. So when we talk about evolution and how humans evolve, we talk a lot about the Game of Thrones show and what happened there, and other pop culture that we mix in so people can relate to the science.
Yeah, great. So I do appreciate you. We're at our hour, so I appreciate your time, and I wish you great futures and hope you embrace AI like I do.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate your having me on your podcast. Bye-bye.